So what we're going to look at today is zero carbon interiors. This all started when the building that we're in. So this building here is the Norton Building in downtown Seattle. It's a 1959 building. It's been around for ages. It's an old SOM building. It's actually the first SOM building in Seattle. It was the first I've seen it lovingly referred to as the first large glass box in this city. But this building got sold and the new owners came in and wanted to have their new tenant renovation set up on the 8th floor here. They came to work with us because we're in the building. We've been here for a while. LMN moved into the building back in 1984. And we have actually kind of have some history looking at both the renovations of the building as well as what impacts these have. Our embodied carbon group was starting to get interested in the idea that interiors might be a major source of embodied carbon when we started looking at Stuart Brand's How Buildings Learn. We're looking at the idea that basically interior renovations happen on a 5 to 15 year cycle. And just thinking about how usually what ends up happening is that you go and you kind of just tear everything out and then rebuild it, especially when you have new tenants coming in. So just basically these floor plates are all designed to be core and shell. You rip everything else out and then put it back in. And even though that, the buildings have these major impacts and their embodied carbon when we build these giant structures, what ends up happening is over the repetitive interior recycling and remodeling, all these cycles, it can actually have a real large cumulative effect and potentially even bigger than the overall embodied carbon structure. You may have seen this slide before. This is Jen Chen's work on the interior embodied carbon discussions. Anyway, similar to kind of get into this idea of like, what is a zero carbon interiors? The client had just released a new set of zero carbon rules. I think MKA kind of set them up with a really good understanding of how they can target embodied carbon reduction on their new construction, but they hadn't developed any sort of system on their on any sort of interior renovations. So they asked us to kind of develop a system for that. So we started looking at what we have for our linear economy, where most of the carbon kind of gets emitted during the raw material phase in production, and then at the end of it, it just gets thrown into a landfill and emitted. So we're trying to figure out ways of like, how do we wrap this around? How do we remove that kind of idea of the raw material phase, and remove that A1 through A3 portion of it? As mentioned, when we look at a typical whole building in LCA, we're looking from the start of when the material is pulled out of the ground all the way till disposal at the end of it, and we have those refurbishment cycles in the middle of it. But when we talk about, say, like an interior scope, we're usually only looking really at about A1 through A5. That's typically about all we have a chance to kind of affect as designers. We have some ability to kind of choose materials that wouldn't have any sort of use emissions or not large amounts of maintenance. But in terms of most interior projects, we don't talk about replacement cycles because the next replacement cycle is going to be the next refurbishment. Operational energy and water, we have some effect over, but typically it's not something that we're talking about, especially not in this project, because we didn't redo many of the fixtures or anything like that, and we didn't replace any of the HVAC and for the overall building. So pretty minor on that. What we started to do, thinking as a team, is starting to think about this. One of the big problems with it is that we weren't able to focus on what was already existing in the space. And we were thinking that there's all this good material in the space that we're going into. Why don't we find a way to reuse it? And when we look at our normal calculations, there's nowhere in here that takes account of any sort of accounting that would push for the idea of reuse. So we kind of came up with our own way of tracking this. And I'd love to hear feedback on the concept of this, but we shifted everything slightly, where we started looking at putting the C1 through C4 of material that was readily available into our own scope, and thinking that because at the end of our renovations and whenever this eventually hits end of life, somebody else will be taking the same building, taking the same floor plate and taking it on themselves. They should probably be looking at what we have left them and figure out how they can use whatever they can use of what's left. So we kind of shift that end of life into our own. So the best thing that we can do in this situation is essentially just stop things in this zone, because then we don't have to worry about all the new A1 through A3 impacts. We developed a kind of way of doing this accounting. We had several different scenarios for materials, looking at what happens to new materials, existing to remain, salvage on site, salvage off site, things like that, and kind of developed this before we started going in and looking at the building. The team then went in and started looking around at the existing site, trying to figure out what they could do to use what was the existing materials and figure out how they can kind of reuse things on site also elsewhere inside this building. This is just a 7,000 square foot renovation, so it's very minor compared to most of the big projects that we're all working on. But I think that we can start using this concept later, because what ended up happening is once the team was given these rules, once the team had this idea in their head, everybody started getting on board. They started looking at the existing conditions. It's kind of a fairly typical, fairly boring office space. The client really didn't like this carpet. They didn't mind these windows around the edge, but they didn't really love kind of the overall layout. So we had to kind of look at ways of adjusting the layout. But we started rethinking, how can we take some of these things, like especially these big ticket items, like the walls that are already built and all the insulation in them, and all this carpet that typically tends to be a pretty high impact thing, but in this case was actually pretty well maintained. And how do we push it forward? We got kind of interested in things like these big glass walls that were being used for the conference rooms. We started looking at some of the acoustical insulation that was in there that was going to be demoed from some of the existing walls. The contractor was getting excited about this. They found a local reuse community that was accepting some of this insulation to help flood victims that were, I think it was just out of Vancouver. And they're finding ways of like reusing this insulation as like actual installation for them. And these are kind of both in progress and finalized things. We kept a lot of the exterior walls to kind of keep things in place and not waste embodied carbon emissions on building new walls or having to like tear these down and rebuild them or find end of life situations. We found ways of removing stuff on site and reusing it. Like the entryway is now actually primarily glass that was taken from those storefronts on the inside for the what's it called, for the conference rooms. The carpet, if you notice, is actually the same carpet. This is kind of funny because apparently the client, when they were first presented with the idea of reusing the carpet, they're like, oh God, no, we hate that carpet. We never want it in there. And so the design team just kind of kept going, kept the idea going, presented their design, and the client was excited about it, had forgotten what the carpet looked like, and was excited how it actually interacted with the new design. And so they're really on board with it now. But part of what happened with this is that we had to go through and selectively demo sections of it that had been damaged or had to be fixed and upkept. And so when we replaced it, we actually ended up with a little bit of space down here out in front of the elevator lobby that we couldn't fix. We had about 300 square feet that was left over that we needed to find. So Jen Chen here, sitting in one of our marketing photos, went out and was reaching out to different marketing or carpeting manufacturers in the area and found Interface and was talking to them about if they had any sort of like leftover attic stock or anything that we could use. And they're like, yeah, we have some attic stock. You should come and take a look at this. We have this space that we have some. They brought her in. She was expecting to find like a very small amount of like a couple boxes of these things. Turns out they have an entire warehouse full of this stuff from projects that buy large amounts of it in the beginning because they think they're going to use it all and end up never actually using it. And so it just gets dumped back to it wasn't Interface, it was Integral, but Integral's warehouses, and they have warehouses full of completely new, never going to be used carpet that they want to find a home for, but they have no connection to be able to kind of like get this stuff out. So we found that to be kind of interesting. We also had this interior wall that was made from offcuts from basically a panelized wood manufacturer. They have all this leftover wood from their process, and they just kind of gave it to us and let us rebuild it into kind of a wall art piece. And then you have things like, your typical stuff where we talk about, hey, we have a reclaimed wood desk or all these little things that we like to do. The big takeaway is that when we look at the baseline, we're coming in at about 4. This is again much smaller than we would normally be doing on a big scale project. But when we're looking at an interiors project, we're looking at about 4 kilogram per square foot GWP for the baseline. If we just did what we would normally do, go in, tear everything else out, and then just do material selections, like we feel very confident about what we're choosing. We're seeking out EPDs and everything. We could get that down to about a 22% reduction in embodied carbon. But the way that we did it, by really focusing on reuse first and trying to get that circular economy idea going, we're able to hit about a 65% reduction in our total global warming potential. So to kind of speed this through and get through this, our other speakers have some time to talk. Some of the takeaways were that trying to find interior EPDs is still a bit of a problem. We were trying to track about 42 different items or 42 different categories of material on the project. We only found information for about 19 of them. We ran into some interesting issues with, say, biogenic materials that would suggest a lot of the wood on our project. If we reused it, like that exterior wall, we have no good way of quantifying it right now, because wood with A1 through A3, at least in a lot of the databases that we're using to try and pull from, is negative. So in the way that the math is telling us is that we should just throw away all the old wood and then just get new wood, because if we keep building with more wood and more wood, we'll eventually solve climate change by these constantly negative numbers. It'd be fantastic. Obviously, there's a bit of a problem with that. We didn't believe that that's the case, so we just kind of left that as a number that was just worst case scenario. When reuse matters, some of the things that really were big on the project were like metal studs, gypsum wallboard, carpet. Furniture was a huge one, so getting more furniture EPDs would be fantastic. The only ones we were able to get were the Aeron chairs, because they have those. Hilariously enough, and that's another thing, the client has a bunch of tenants. One of the tenants moved out during the pandemic, left all of their furniture and everything, had all these Aeron chairs. And the client was debating whether or not they wanted to buy new Aeron chairs or like reuse the existing ones. And we're looking at these, and the perfectly good, almost brand new Aeron chairs. Like, we know how much these cost. I don't understand why you're not suggesting it. And it ended up being about 16% of the overall carbon budget on this project. So that was kind of fun. But then come down into like the pros and cons of material reuse to get us into that side of things. What we found is that we could choose high quality materials, but oftentimes the high quality materials and the low carbon materials had long lead times. And this was such a quick process that what was benefiting us is that even though we could find these materials, we weren't able to procure them in time. But when we went on the zero economy or the circular economy scale, one of the things that was great is that it was super quick. It was immediately available. We could put it in whenever we found it. But the big issue was sourcing material. Like, we could never find enough cabinetry to actually do the cabinets in our process or in our building. It never worked. So that was kind of always the hard thing, is trying to find that marketplace. It was always having to find things from different individual discrete entities. And so that kind of gets us to the last thing, the sourcing. Like, we learned a lot about what is out there. We learned about these warehouses of attic stock, but there isn't a kind of overarching thing. We're still trying to figure out how we can make that into something where, as designers, we have a resource that it's easy to kind of go and pull from. But with that, I'm going to pass it over. I'm going to end it here. If you have any questions, throw them in the chat, but I'm going to pass it over to Mabo, who is working on that side of deconstruction and demolition, and moving away from the idea of like tearing everything down, throwing it into a landfill, and trying to create this circular economy.